Evolution is taught as undisputed fact in public schools across the nation, but it wasn't always this way. After World War I, a movement that opposed evolution began, and under the leadership of a U.S. politician by the name of William Jennings Bryant, teaching evolution was banned in many states.
In 1925 was the Scopes trial. Now it was called the Scopes monkey trial, and it's understood today as this sort of clash between fundamentalist religion and real science. But that's not what it was in 1925. William Jennings Bryant was on the anti-evolution side. One of the things he was concerned about, he had been in the State Department during World War I, and they had got reports in World War I of German officers discussing social Darwinism. That is, that what Darwinism meant was the strong should simply overpower the weak. And there was a movement of eugenics, killing off weak, old, or disabled people.
Eugenics is the killing or forced sterilization of people to improve the human population.
And that, in the minds of a lot of scholars, was associated with believing in evolution. And so for a lot of people in America, the question of evolution wasn't about descent with modification in terms of where we came from. It was about eugenics and social Darwinism and ultimately racism. And that's why Bryant, as a Democrat, was very much against teaching evolution the way it was in the book that was actually used in the Scopes trial. And also during that time, there were a couple of books written, the most popular by Draper and White. Draper's book was called The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, which basically made this argument that there was this intractable conflict between science and faith. That either you were going to be a modern scientific person or you were going to be an ancient backwoods religious believer. And you had to make a choice between the two because they were in conflict with each other. And the stories that were told were stories about Columbus and Galileo and people like that, and how religion fought against science, but science was able to grow up and be strong and to fight through the ignorance of religious people.
Where did the myth that science and faith are in conflict come from? In the late 19th century, two very influential books were published. John William Draper's book, History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, was published in 1874. Then in 1896, Andrew Dickson White's book, A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, was published. Both these books pushed the conflict myth.
They gave this historical view that science and religion have always been at odds. The impetus behind both of these is not particularly historical. It's rooted in political and social events of the time. So the problem with the books is that they're terrible history. The historical facts, that's very generous to call them facts, are cherry-picked or contorted, taken out of context in order to promote the author's main ideas about this perpetual warfare between science and religion. The word scientist is only created in the 1830s. Draper and White are part of this professionalization of the sciences, and so they're carving out a niche, a social niche, a political niche for the scientist, the person who does the sciences. The legacy of these two books, of these two men, are foundational. Journalists tend to take the Draper and White theses of conflict or warfare between science and religion as the fundamental starting point for everything else. So even 150 years after these books were published, and after a time when people no longer actually read them, they have given the stage direction, so to speak, for scientists and religionists to attack each other.
The larger picture one gets from reading Draper and White is that the history of science and religion is a narrative of unending, inevitable conflict, with the church constantly losing to science, and the implication being science someday will completely supplant the church. I'm going to turn to a paragraph in Andrew Dickson White's book, and I will read even just selectively from that paragraph. White says, and I quote, "While Lutheranism was thus condemning the theory of the earth's movement, other branches of the Protestant Church did not remain behind. Calvin took the lead in his commentary on Genesis by condemning all who asserted that the earth is not at the center of the universe. He says, to close the paragraph, and even John Wesley declared the new ideas to, quote, tend toward infidelity, unquote." Well, that's a remarkable paragraph. Remarkable for what it does with history that never happened. Calvin never said anything at all about the Copernican system. The second quotation, allegedly giving a view of John Wesley, who is supposed to have rejected Copernicanism, according to A.D. White, is based on a prior historical work of someone else who didn't know how to read primary sources very well. And that particular reference is based on a sermon that John Wesley gave in which he mentioned the idea of the plurality of worlds, the hypothesis that there might be more than one universe. That's an idea that was popular in the 18th century in the wake of Copernicanism. That's the idea that he was rejecting in the passage that White seems to think was about Copernicanism itself.
At about the same time as Andrew Dickson White's book was published, some of the most important discoveries in physics were being made in Cambridge, England. Many of them by scientists who saw no conflict between their science and their Christian faith.
Most of the stories that you may have heard about the church persecuting Galileo for his scientific thought and all that sort of thing is totally wrong, but a lot of people still believe those myths because myths oftentimes have better sticking power than fact. Now, what this created was, at the turn of the 20th century, a very, very tense and conflicted understanding of what it meant to be a Christian in the modern world. Now, in 1922, the same time, was published one of the most famous books in the fundamentalist modernist controversy by a guy named J. Gresham Machen, who is probably one of the smartest fundamentalists of this first generation. And essentially what he argued in Christianity and liberalism was that modernism or liberalism was a different religion than Christianity. That the two were not different ways of understanding Christianity, but the liberalism was a fundamentally different religion. That it didn't believe in the same God, it didn't believe in the same mechanisms of salvation, it didn't believe in the same destiny, it didn't believe in the same meaning, it didn't believe in the same moralities. They were fundamentally different. And what Gresham argues, Machen argues in this book, is that what liberalism does is it takes the words of Christian faith, salvation, atonement, Savior, God, and takes out their historical meaning and puts in a new modernist meaning in such a way as that they say the same words, he argued, but they mean something totally different. And the result is a completely different religion. Liberals believed salvation related to social change rather than salvation spiritually in heaven mostly. Because of that, they tend to focus on what was called the social gospel, or the political development of a better society. That's what they saw salvation as being strongly related to. In the modern church world, you have expressions of liberalism or modernism still. In fact, most American churches probably fit in this category. That some of the doctrinal beliefs or doctrinal losses in liberal Christianity are really terribly bad and should be avoided, and that they're really good scientific and biblical answers for some of the objections of things liberalism has taken on by trying to stay with it, but actually has taken on much more than they need to and not actually integrated very well.